The iPhone XR is dead. Or at least, it's no longer receiving any new major software updates, with iOS 26 dropping support for Apple's 2018 flagships, the iPhone XR, XS, and XS Max. These phones will be forever stuck on iOS 18, and while this by no means makes them completely useless or obsolete, they're very unlikely to be a pleasant experience all these years later, and they won't be getting any new features. From Apple's point of view, they might as well be dead. Hey, how's it going? I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and the iPhone XR when it came out was one of the most unique iPhones Apple had ever made to date, closely paralleling the iPhone 5C with the flashy bright colors and lower tier hardware and design compared to its more expensive counterpart, but there was a major difference. The iPhone XR was actually good value at $750 and in some ways even superior to the $1,000 plus iPhone XS, though it wasn't without its controversy. Today, I want to talk about the only iPhone that could realistically be considered the iPhone 9, had Apple not skipped that number completely. So let's talk about what the iPhone XR brought to the table, how it's performed over the years, and what exactly made it such a massive success. Today we discuss the life, death, and legacy of the iPhone XR.
We want to reach as many customers as we can with this incredible technology. So that's why we are very excited to show you one more iPhone.
4 years ago, almost exactly, I made a video with this exact same subject as Apple had just dropped the iPhone XR from their lineup. So yes, now I have 2 videos called The Death of the iPhone XR. But iPhones really have 3 or 4 deaths in total, if we're gonna go by my own meaningless criteria that allows me to better utilize clickbait. The first death is when Apple stops selling an iPhone, and the second is when that iPhone is no longer getting major iOS updates. I would consider the third death to be the least exciting, where every iPhone eventually will get to the point when the security updates dry up completely and most apps on the App Store will no longer support the version of iOS you're running. The iPhone 6s, SE, and 7 are all going through this process right now as they get fewer and fewer updates for iOS 15 over time, and more apps are becoming incompatible. But of course, even then, old iPhones can still be somewhat usable. You can download old versions of apps, which may work just fine depending on what it is, but no smartphone lasts forever, and eventually each and every phone will be nothing more than landfill fodder. I mean, unless you recycle your phone, which you should probably do. But that's the fourth and final death, when the iPhone is no more useful than a paperweight, at least when it comes to anything practical. Technically, I can do some limited web browsing even on the first iPhone from 2007, but it's hard not to consider that phone and its 2G networking capabilities completely and utterly obsolete. For the iPhone XR, we've now seen its second death, with no iOS 26 support, though 7 years of software updates is still plenty impressive. The actual experience on the XR running iOS 18 is also respectable, with mediocre but still usable performance in my experience with the phone, and there will still be years of security updates, app updates that continue to come through. Going into 2026, the XR's biggest enemy is probably battery life, I mean aside from maybe feeling pretty slow. I do want to kick this off by talking about the life of the iPhone XR, from its launch to today. So let's rewind back all the way to 2017.
We do have one more thing.
2017 would mark a monumental shifting point for Apple in how they would structure their iPhone lineup moving forward. We didn't get one, but 2 new iPhone generations at 2 very different price points. You had the iPhone 8 and 8 Plus at the same price you would expect, continuing the iPhone 7's design but adding a glass backing for wireless charging, and a typical slew of upgrades we might see in any given year like the A11 chipset, upgraded cameras, and so on and so forth, with the 8 Plus and the 7 Plus including the second telephoto camera lens. But then we would have one more thing, something new and unique, the iPhone X, or X as it would painfully often be called by customers. This phone was arguably the first Pro iPhone, even if it didn't have that title. It was significantly more expensive and one of the first $1,000 smartphones on the market at all. And with that price came no more home button in favor of a small bezel design with only a notch intruding into the most immersive display that I think had probably been on any smartphone by 2017. It was a culmination of Apple and Samsung making just this gorgeous OLED panel. Some still preferred the curved edges of the S8, but that iPhone X was truly something special, and the design was so exciting. Dropping the top and bottom bezels allowed for more space vertically, and everything the iPhone X brought has dramatically altered the path of smartphone evolution over the past 8 years. The iPhone X was new, fresh, exciting. It even had an emoji. It was the complete package. But if you wanted a phone that was more familiar and cheaper to boot, heck, the iPhone 8 Plus even had better battery life than the iPhone X, and didn't have any compromise outside of having an LCD panel instead of OLED. The iPhone X was a fantastic device, but it did have some drawbacks. It wasn't a big phone and is downright small by today's standards. The battery life was really mid, and that price point put this phone out of the question for a lot of people who may have otherwise really wanted it. If only there was a phone that looked like the iPhone X but was, you know, $250 cheaper. Well, have no fear, because a year later, Apple would make the perfect phone for you.
We're going to take iPhone X to the next level. I'm excited to show you what is by far the most advanced iPhone we have ever created.
September 2018, Apple would hit the stage first announcing the iPhone XS and XS Max, which would end up themselves being some of the strangest iPhones Apple has ever made for a multitude of reasons. And if you'd like to see a video on the death of the iPhone XS and XS Max, you can let me know by hitting the like button on this video. I'm certainly not opposed to doing it, but anyways, something that was very un-Apple-like was they actually announced the iPhone XR after their main flagship in the XS. And I don't remember another time since this that Apple has announced any other phone than the Pro last. Even recently, the iPhone Air was shown off before the iPhone 17 Pro, despite it being arguably the more hyped and exciting phone. Even the iPhone 5C in 2013 was shown off directly before the iPhone 5S. But the iPhone XR is no iPhone 5C. It's better in basically every way, and it would make for the perfect in-between device for the iPhones of old and this new era of no home button and thin bezels. While Apple would keep the iPhone 8s and 8 Plus within their lineup for the time being, the iPhone X was dropped completely, replaced outright by the XS, which is another parallel to 2013, as Apple stopped selling the iPhone 5 after only a year. Historically, Apple would just lower the price of their previous device and keep it around, but likely in large part because costs to make these phones like the 5 or the iPhone X were still quite high, Apple would instead make a new, more budget-oriented phone that was cheaper both for themselves as well as the consumer. And there was quite a bit of controversy surrounding the iPhone XR when it was first announced too. This came down to its feature set, including a display resolution that was deemed unacceptable by some at the time. But let's start with what we have here in my hand before we get into some of the particulars. The iPhone XR has a less premium design than that of the XS and XS Max, but it's also a lot more fun. White, black, blue, yellow, coral, product red, there's something here for everyone. That coral I especially loved back in the day, and it reminds me a lot of the cosmic orange on my new iPhone 17 Pro, though the XR gives a more salmon-y vibe, I would say, depending on the angle and lighting. Still, it's pretty cool, and hey, we even have an aluminum frame on both of these phones, though the XR's isn't as sleek or flat. We've got curved sides, just like the iPhone 8 and 8 Plus, and a glossy glass backing. The rear camera lens no longer has the sort of soft, rounded bump like on the iPhone 8, but instead a more sharp protrusion that we've become very familiar with over the years. The flash was moved to below the sensor, giving this more unique vertical look, even though there's only one lens. And it was that single camera lens that was the second biggest downside coming from the iPhone XS, not because of the lens itself, but because of what we didn't have. We do have the main 12 megapixel wide lens off of the iPhone XS, but we missed out on the 12 megapixel 2x zoom telephoto lens. In past iPhone models, you would need a second camera lens to even take portrait photos, which around this time was still a fairly new feature, but thankfully the XR could take portrait shots using software processing to blur the background. And while the results could be a bit inconsistent at times, it still made for a cool effect. A bit less versatile, sure, and the iPhone cameras were maybe lagging behind some of the competitors like the Pixel 3 around this time, but it was a solid camera setup, and it made sense for the XR. Losing the telephoto, yeah, it's too bad, but it wasn't the biggest deal. What was the biggest deal shows up when we turn the phone to the front, that 6.1-inch liquid retina LCD display with some chonky bezels. Face ID here was as great as always, and the bezels were big in parts so the LCD could even work for this full screen design. This was actually a pretty impressive screen, the way it was built, all things considered, but the resolution and pixel density had some people concerned. The resolution was higher than 720p, but not by a whole lot, and the pixel density was only 326 pixels per inch, the same as Apple had been using in most iPhones going all the way back to the 2010 iPhone 4. Thing is, the iPhone 4 was 3.5 inches diagonally, the XR is 6.1, and that's quite big. So the picture is visibly less sharp than an iPhone XS or nearly any Android competitor around this price point. The iPhone 8 Plus had also been 1080p and gave us 401 pixels per inch, so it did feel odd that Apple was kinda just cheaping out here. I wouldn't go so far to say that this screen is fuzzy, and I actually think it looks totally fine, but this was a major sticking point for some tech reviewers in 2018, even before the phone came out. Back then, I was a bit more of an Apple fanboy than I am now, and I even made a video myself arguing against a lot of what I'd been seeing online. So many people seemed to think the iPhone XR sucked even before it came out, and I didn't think that was fair. The iPhone XR doesn't suck, nor is it overpriced. These were the very early days of my channel, and it wasn't a particularly well-presented video for what it's worth. Most of it was arguing against Unbox Therapy, who had done a video calling the XR depressing because of its screen. And because I did that, I think it got recommended to his viewers, and so I kinda got dislike bombed, which maybe it was deserved, probably not this many. It's the most amount of dislikes I've ever had on a video. It was pretty wild, but at least I got a ton of views out of it. Of course, once the phone was in the hands of reviewers, complaints about the resolution died pretty quickly as time went on. The reality was that the type of user who bought the iPhone XR didn't care too much about the display outside of it, being good enough, having a good size, and also having that new home buttonless design. The sharper, more vivid picture on the OLED of the iPhone XS was far, far superior, to be sure. Like, it is way better, but it doesn't inherently alter the iOS experience so much just to have everything look nicer. The new OLED screen was a luxury, not a necessity, and Apple still putting in this very solid LCD allowed them to sell the phone for a whole lot less than the XS. And there was even some upside to the XR too. The $1,000 iPhone XS was 5.8 inches versus the XR at 6.1 inches. A decently bigger screen for $250 less. Pretty nice bonus. The XS Max, of course, was the biggest at 6.5 inches and was a much needed addition after the iPhone X was only 5.8 inches. The XR is a whole lot more bulky though. It's less premium for sure without the stainless steel sides, and man, those bezels are thick. But these are things that most people didn't really care much about at the time, and for those who did, they could go up to the XS, like I myself did in 2018. One big benefit of LCD though, as well as that lower resolution, is there's some serious upside in power performance, and the iPhone XR's physical size allowed for a battery only a bit smaller than the one in the XS Max. The iPhone XS and XS Max I think are pretty well known at this point for having pretty bad battery life. Despite the Max being as big as it is, Apple would fix that with the 11 Pro the next year, but for the time being, the iPhone XR was rated for 16 hours of video playback versus 14 and 15 in the most expensive iPhones. So to be clear, you got a bigger display, better battery, and some fun color options, all for $250 less than the iPhone XS. Otherwise, you still had the A12 chipset, only 3 gigs of RAM in the XR versus 4 in the XS, but the actual performance gains from this aren't exactly going to be life-changing in typical usage. The XR had IP67 water and dust resistance versus IP68. We did lose out on 3D Touch completely, though it would also be gone from the 11 Pro the next year and was eventually pretty much completely phased out within iOS updates. Like, it kind of lost all of its extra functionality. The iPhone XR shipped with 64 gigabytes at $750, but for only $50 more you could get the 128 gigabyte model, or for $900 you could get 256 gigs. This was actually a really nice option to have, and it's one that was exclusive to the XR. The XS came in 64, 256, and 512 gigabytes at $999, $1149, and $1349 respectively, so getting more storage with Apple's best flagship would cost you a pretty penny. But the XR? Hey, sure, you can have double the storage for only $50, why not? There might be other small differences, but at its core, the iPhone XR was almost the perfect non-pro iPhone. It was fun, it cut costs where it made sense, and even offered a few benefits over the $1,000 plus models. Gave users this home buttonless design, and whether it was OLED or not, for a lot of people just did not matter. While no one could say for sure what the future might hold for the iPhone XR, it was a fantastic successor to the iPhone 8, and the ideal choice for most people buying a new iPhone 7 years ago, without a doubt. Actually, I'll say it. This was one of the best smartphones you could buy 7 years ago, period, if only for the longevity factor.
What a fantastic new lineup of iPhones. It's clearly the best lineup we've had by far, taking the breakthroughs of iPhone 10 even further than before and making them available to even more people.
The iPhone XR shipped on iOS 12, which was an update focused on improving performance and stability after the disastrous and bug-ridden iOS 11. This meant a solid experience out of the box, and over the years, I'm happy to say I don't think that's really changed much, even with plenty of software updates, assuming that the battery health is still within an optimal range. Sure, it's not fast, it's gotten slower, it depends what you do with it, but it's not unusable. We're not looking at how iPhones used to perform on their final iOS versions, like the iPhone 4S on iOS 9 or something. In 2019, Apple would introduce the iPhone 11 and 11 Pro, centering the Apple logo and knocking the iPhone XR down a tier within the lineup. The 11 was very similar to the XR, but a surprisingly big upgrade, and one that came in at only $700 rather than $750, an actual price reduction, which is something we basically never get to see from Apple anymore. It got the new ultra-wide camera lens and night photography features that also came with the 11 Pro, as well as other typical improvements to the hardware, but all in all, it was a very similar device to the XR. The XR would go from $750 to only $600, making it pretty great value, though the iPhone 11 at only $100 more did also bring quite a bit of improvement. If you cared about the cameras, the 11 was the better choice, but if you didn't, the XR was there and it was really solid. In 2020, Apple would finally put the OLED screen in their non-Pro models with the iPhone 12 and 12 mini, but they also took advantage of this change by raising the price. The 12 mini was still only $700, but it was very small, and the 12 at $800 would eventually become the standard non-Pro price tag. Makes that $750 for the XR seem pretty dang good in hindsight when you consider how well it held up against the $1,000 XS. It's gotten just as much iOS support as that phone, and it's aged just as well, if not better, if only thanks to battery life. With the iPhone 12 line, Apple would continue to keep the XR around at $500, and the 11 became $600. You also had the second generation iPhone SE, which had been released early 2020 at $400, making for one of the most complete iPhone lineups I think Apple has ever had. Honestly, it was pretty solid around this time. Apple's cheapest iPhone today is $600, and the iPhone 15 was only just recently discontinued 2 years after it launched. The XR, on the other hand, after coming fall 2018, would be sold by Apple brand new until fall 2021. And it would stick around even longer past that in the certified refurbished section. But the phone was getting older. It did have to be dropped eventually. So it did make sense with the iPhone 13 line, as the iPhone 11 could slot right into that $500 price tag. Hence my video 4 years ago talking about the first death of the iPhone XR. Fast forwarding 4 years, and we get to fall 2025, with the launch of iOS 26 and this new liquid glass interface. This is a more substantial iOS update than we're used to, so it might feel like you're missing out if you're still on the XR. But we do still have iOS 18, which shook up the look of iOS in its own right with tinted icons. This phone can still be a usable experience today if you need it to be. It can download most apps, and do most things that, like, my iPhone 17 Pro can do. It's not fast, in fact it can be slow, but I wouldn't call it yet obsolete. After all, we've only hit the second death, which means we still probably have another 2 to 3 years of continued app compatibility, and who knows how long we'll see security updates for. For a phone that was so clowned on when it was released for having a sub 1080p display, it's remarkable how much better the iPhone XR has aged over the Android competition from the era. This wasn't even Apple's best iPhone either, it was their mid-range model. But you have something like that gorgeous Galaxy S9 with its way nicer screen, sure. But its last major update was, let me check here, in 2020, a half decade ago. The iPhone XR lived a long, full life, and while it may not have too many users left, it would still work in a pinch or as a backup phone just fine, and I do believe Apple deserves so much credit for that.
The summary of this video is that I think the argument that the iPhone XR sucks because its display sucks just kind of misses the point of it. The display doesn't really matter on the iPhone XR. What matters is that it's still a premium device to an extent and is going to be more than good enough for the millions and millions of people who are going to buy it regardless of the resolution, because they don't care or know what a resolution is.
The iPhone 5C in 2013 was an iPhone 5 in a plastic shell. It brought none of the new features seen on the iPhone 5S, and while the colors were new for Apple and very fun, it was clear Apple wanted an iPhone they could produce on the cheap and just sell in place of the iPhone 5. But for only $100 more, you could get the 5S, a phone with a better chipset, premium design, Touch ID, not to beat a dead horse/phone any more than necessary, but the 5C would only get updates to iOS 10, whereas the 5S got to iOS 12, and in combination with everything else, it's only made the 5C look even worse in hindsight. The iPhone XR on paper might seem very similar to the 5C, coming out alongside an S model, albeit one far less exciting than the 5S was. But realistically, beyond the vibrant colors, the XR was better than the 5C in every way. The design didn't feel cheap. It wasn't plastic, it was the same as the iPhone 8 and the 8 Plus, with aluminum and glass, premium materials. It had the same main camera as the XS, it had the same chipset, it had a highly coveted feature and that new home button-less design. Add in some of the benefits like the 6.1-inch display and better battery life, and you had a phone that, in my opinion, was completely worth its price point, and probably more so than the XS was. The hate for this phone in 2018 was really overblown, and it also never really mattered, because it wasn't a phone for the sort of person who cares about pixel density or OLED versus LCD. The XR was a phone focused on being an amazing experience for the average user, and it nailed that element better than maybe any other phone from 2018. Mind you, it doesn't excuse the terrible naming scheme around this time or how Apple skipped the iPhone 9 altogether. The 10 or X was supposed to be Roman numerals, representing the 10-year anniversary of iPhone, and that was confusing enough. Throwing another letter on there wasn't gonna help. The iPhone XR would suffer the same fate as every other X-branded iPhone from this era, being called the iPhone XR even to this day by far too many people out there. Heck, I think I've even called it that a few times accidentally before, and I make a living talking about these iPhones. At least saying XR isn't as bad as XS, which, kind of sounds like a word Apple probably shouldn't have been associating with their new $1,000 flagship that barely changed anything from the previous model. What does the R stand for, you ask? Good question. The answer is kind of nothing, sort of. Phil Schiller at one point talked about sports cars, how you often see Type R or Type S denotations on faster cars, so 10R, it's like 10 Type R, I don't know. This still feels like a weird choice, especially since the C in 5C clearly stood for colors. SE stands for Special Edition. They've been using S since the iPhone 3GS, where they said it stood for speed. Thankfully, the 2019 iPhone 11 and 11 Pro would fix the naming scheme altogether and set up Apple to continue their release pattern for the future. This makes the iPhone XR even more unique in hindsight, with a name that, like its older brother in the 5C, will never be used in any form again. I don't think we'll ever see another R iPhone. The iPhone XR's legacy is colorful in every way possible. It was fun, controversial, and most of all, really popular among new iPhone buyers for many years. This is a good phone, if not great, and I think the iPhone XR deserves to be remembered, even if much about it isn't all that memorable in the grand scheme of things. I mean, the iPhone 11 was basically the same thing but better, but the XR was still first, and it was the iPhone 5C done right. It set Apple up for even more success in the future. Plus, hey, millions of people used this phone, and hopefully they had a good experience with it. And if any of you ever used the iPhone XR, make sure you let me know in the comments down below. What do you think of this phone, even if you didn't own it? How do you feel about it all these years later? And hey, if you could maybe throw this video a like or even a hype, I would really appreciate it. And don't forget to subscribe for more content just like this, including potentially a video on the death of the iPhone XS, along with plenty more tech content. Still working on my 17 Pro review, so watch out for that. We do have a Discord server if you want to come by and say hi, link in the description. Great community over there. Thank you so much to the channel members for your continued support, and thank you all for watching. I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and I will see you all next time.